Hello, everyone. Welcome to Family Restoration and Healing Center's COVID-19 Coping Tips series. I am Joyce Jones. Today's topic is healthy family relationships and setting boundaries. I'm joined by Tamia Pleasance, the owner and lead counselor for Nialu Therapeutics. She is also the licensed clinical counselor for Family Restoration and Healing Center. Also, we have Steve Osterhout, a licensed clinical social worker, counselor with Safe Harbor Christians Counseling. Welcome to you both.
Well, thanks. Good to be here.
Great. It's going to be an awesome session today. And this is the last of four of our series for COVID-19 coping tips. Like I said, today we're talking about healthy family relationships and setting boundaries. The goal of this session is to provide tools for communication, stress management, and problem solving for marriages and family dynamics. So let's start with you, Steve, today. What does healthy relationship look like?
Well, as we were talking about just a moment ago, we could spend a tremendous amount of time talking about this particular topic today. But in general, when I think about healthy relationships, whether it's a marital relationship, a friend relationship, or even a parent-child relationship, I think about it in terms of it being beneficial for all involved, mutually beneficial, like in a marriage. And I think some of the components that you might see in a relationship like that is that generally everybody is better off because of the relationship. You really bring out the best in each other. And one of the things that I really like to consider with relationships and the opportunity that exists in relationships is this idea of affirmation. And affirmation, I think, is when we can give feedback to somebody we know really well, and we can tell them the truth about who they are, and about how God has made them and how they're designed. And so there may be nice things, but most importantly, they're affirming things to help people really know who they are. And I think that's one of the benefits of healthy relationships.
I think so too. The benefits to healthy relationships is really understanding who your partner is.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the common stress factors maybe that comes along with knowing who your partner is? What are some of the common stress factors marriages and family dynamic experiences, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic? And Timia, do you want to give us a little
Sure.
bit about that?
I mean, I think one of the common stress factors in regard to, the pandemic has been about just kind of all being on top of each other. And there's not a lot of physical space, right? Where I think the commutes, if you have other people in your family running them to their events, and that created enough space sometimes to allow that other person's stuff and maybe my own stuff to be, exhibited differently. But if I'm carrying around my laundry bag of stuff, and then my spouse, and then my kids, and then whoever else lives in the house has their own laundry bag, we're running out of space. And so I think that, being able to just communicate with each other, and when I mean by communicate, sometimes just like opening your mouth and using your words, right? I think that's a common stress factor. We kind of talked about it before, but this sense of not feeling like you have control, right? Because my job's shut down, and then now they're talking about we're going to come back in the office, and now and I have to. So there's so many things again that feel out of my control, and the only people I have access to are the people in my house, so they're going to get it. And so I think a lot of that outside stress that I don't get to control, I'm going to control, ultimately what I get to say to the other people in my house. And a lot of times it's not so nice. So I think those are some of the common stress, factors. Trying to figure out, again, if you have school-aged kids at home, sharing the Wi-Fi, if you have limited resources pre-pandemic, right? Maybe we only had one computer, one laptop, but there's 4 of us who need that, right? So then that touches on my budgeting, why. So all of those different things. So then there's financial stressors, right? Food lasting. I know it's like a competition in my house, who can finish the juice first. And I'm like, hey, it's not a race, but so I'm going to the grocery store a lot often. And a lot of those things that when we had those distractions pre-pandemic, they weren't as in our face, but now they're in our face. And I think it's just that stuff was already there, but now we can't hide from it. There's no distractions. All of our laundry bags are bumping into each other. And so I think those are just some of the more common ones that we talk about when we talk about, the common stress of
Right.
COVID.
Absolutely. And you started off by talking about how when you go, going back to work, dealing with things that you don't have much control over, you don't have the luxury, you may be frustrated and stressed and, dealing with anxiety with, issues at work, but you don't have the luxury of really doing a lot about that. So when you come home, you may be wanting or really needing to get that, let that out. And I think, like you said, just really understanding that your spouse giving you that space and, understanding that you need to maybe you need to come home and let some of that out. So, so is that part of a tip that you could provide to couples on how to manage all the stress that they're dealing with? Is that a tip that you could provide? And are there any other tips that you could suggest on what to do when you're home with your spouse, with your family, and you need to, let it out?
Yeah, I'll jump on this one if that's okay.
Okay.
We all know how important it is, to provide care for ourselves. We hear that all the time, self-care. And what does that really mean? And some of it we already know, but part of it is giving yourself permission to care for yourself. We hear all the time, especially in church, it's so important to treat other people well. But sometimes we forget that it's important to treat ourselves well. In fact, I'd like to remind people a lot of times, when you think about the greatest commandment, the second part, love your neighbor as yourself, there are really kind of 3 parts to that, right? You love your neighbor, you love yourself, and then you allow your neighbor to love you. Which I think all of those are really, really important. But loving yourself is about self-care. And it's not like this, grandiose, oh, aren't I so fantastic? It's about being appreciative of being made in God's image, and that we have value as people, and that this world is stressful. It is really hard, and a pandemic like COVID-19 just makes it that much more difficult to manage day-to-day functioning. It's just very, very stressful. So some practical things. A lot of these won't be new, but remember to do things like to breathe. That diaphragmatic breathing, it really helps to reduce stress in amazing ways. And so much of the time when you're intentional about breathing that way, you can slow things down. It's really kind of fun because, sometimes I encourage people, if you have a Fitbit or something that keeps track of your heart rate, you can actually watch your heart rate slow down a little bit oftentimes when you do the diaphragmatic breathing. So you can get this kind of quick biofeedback, that, hey, this works. It's kind of cool. And it really is amazing. But a lot of times, when we're living life and running from one thing to the next and stressed out and our mind is just churning, it's hard to remember to slow down and breathe and be aware to breathe in that kind of a way. Things like sleeping well as best you can, drinking fluids, being careful about alcohol consumption in particular, but drinking fluids, making sure that there are things that help your body function the way that God designed our bodies to function. And one of my favorite things has to do with endorphins. You've heard about endorphins. What are endorphins? Well, they're hormones. They're, it's the ways that our body functions. And there are certain things that you can do to help your body produce endorphins. Things like, getting exercise, physical activity. You don't have to run a marathon, but things that get your heart rate up a little bit, walking is really good, things like that. Another way that your body can produce endorphins, and I love this one, is laughter. So sometimes, like, it can be just great fun to plan ahead and think about, okay, what comedians make me laugh? What shows are likely to help our family just sit around the TV and laugh together? It's an amazing thing when you're intentional about creating opportunities to promote laughter. And a lot of times, we probably all laugh sometimes, but usually it's in reaction to something that happens. But sometimes we can be proactive and create a likelihood of an environment where laughter can happen. And I just really encourage people to be intentional about that kind of stuff. Another one, again, is really being intentional about gratitude. I talk about gratitude quite often because I really believe gratitude is the way to stay grounded in truth. We're reminding ourselves in our thinking and where we're focusing our thoughts on things that are truthful, things we're grateful for, whether they're environmental things, whether it's remembering God's promises and those types of things. Being grateful, intentional, in an intentional way in our own mind, or maybe even sharing that with other people. I think gratitude can be incredibly helpful. And the reality is, even when things are really, really hard, there's some things that don't change. God's promises don't change. God's word doesn't change. God's presence doesn't change. And those staying focused on those things, even through a really challenging situation, sometimes can keep us grounded, so we don't fall into that place of despair, or we don't, get into that place where we just can't function. It's hard. It's really hard, and that's understandable. But those are some of the things that kind of came to mind for me.
Oh, I like that. Do you have anything to add to that, Tamia?
I think we're done.
Should I ask?
I think, especially like when I work with couples, is just intentional ways of connecting, right? And so again, pre-pandemic, we had this way of, greeting each other because we had gone, 6, 8, 10 hours without seeing each other. But now while we're in it, like I'm upstairs, they're downstairs. So so there's no like, there's no moment of I've missed you, right? And so being creative and in connecting with each other, right? Especially if both are still in the home, working from home, how do you create that separation from your work, or from if you're in school, or, and then how do you connect or reconnect with your family, right? And of course, again, it was easy when it was like, hey, I'm picking you up from school. How was school? What did you do? And there's that energy there. But, with this, there's not a lot of energy because it's like, I just passed you 5 minutes ago on my way to the kitchen, right? To get some juice, probably. And so, being creative in how we connect with each other, right? And building that intimacy, right? Especially for married couples, so many different levels of intimacy, and all are so important. And so I think being intentional about that is really key in keeping some of that stress down, right? Or in those moments where the stress is really high because we were just hit with an unexpected situation, then because we've gotten used to connecting together, we will automatically lean in towards each other during those extra hard times rather than lean away from each other. Because again, we've already have the habit of how we connect on a day-to-day basis. So when we get hit hard, and notice I'm saying when we get hit hard, right?
Mhm.
So even if it's my third cousin who suddenly passed away, we got hit hard. So now I get to lean in on my spouse and he gets to lean in on me as we figure this out together. And it's because of those intentional connection times that help make that a little bit easier.
No, that's really good. Yeah, it's about we, both of us are in this together. We're couples are a team. Marriage is like a business, partnership. We're working together, and things are coming at you, and you really need to, I think we really need to see that as we're working together for this. I like what you mentioned, about the intimacy, and there's different levels of intimacy. For my husband and I, one day he came home from work and he just gave me a hug, and he usually do, but this one time he just held me for a bit. We just hold each other, and it was therapy. It was really therapeutic.
Mm,
And so we started doing that. When he come home from work, we just take that time and just hold each other and like take a deep breath, a long exhale. And it truly, truly does something. Steve was mentioning being intentional about
yeah,
these things.
yeah,
And I hate to say that we did fall out of that when when the pandemic hit and we were home. We didn't have a chance to miss each other and then come back. But he has since started work, and he came home and I was like, oh wow, I miss just doing that hug. But no, I really like that. And I encourage uh, couples to do that, to find some way to and even I think I recall from a marriage conference that they said, for a Christian marriage conference, said something to the fact that we should find a way to touch, once, we're so busy, getting things done. My husband and I were good. We're like, okay, what are we doing today? What do we got to get done this week? That, we're just machine going, but,
yeah,
try to, find some time to hold, my husband's good at that, holding hands, and, or some way to touch each other, once a day. But no, thank you both for that. Go ahead, Steve. I see you
I
want to
just
say
want to
something.
follow up on what you were talking about, because yeah, it's so important in relationships, and marriages, and I was talking about endorphins, and another component of our physiological functioning that God created us is that
Mhm.
when you and your husband are hugging each other, your bodies are producing oxytocin, which is another chemical. It's just beautiful. It's wonderful. I
mhm,
mean, we
Wow.
are
mhm,
fearfully and wonderfully made. And there's some
yeah,
really, really, really good things. And these are the types of things that are just in us, and the
Mhm.
way that they are produced is through things like that, and
Yes.
it really is. It's a beautiful thing. And all those things actually contribute to reducing the experience of stress.
Hmm.
And it gets our bodies, it helps to reduce the amount of cortisol. That's the stress hormone. It's just
mhm,
amazing. And
mhm,
and that kind of intentional component is,
Mhm.
kind of helping our bodies function the way God designed our bodies to function.
Yeah.
That's, so yeah, I loved your example. So
No, I like that. And when you were saying that, I was like, wow, yes, it's important to understand that, you know, our body should function the way that God has it to function. So no, no, I like that. Okay, and so just going back a little bit to the communication uh, between couples, any tips on, how to communicate and how to problem solve? Um, we'll start with you, Steve.
yeah, sure. It's, you know, anybody that spent any time with me when it comes to communication, and to me, I heard you say the exact same thing. It's like you used the last conference, or the last session we were in, you used
Mhm.
wait, why am I talking, which
mhm,
ushers in the opportunity to listen.
yeah,
Mm.
Communication starts with listening. And listening is about communicating, understanding. And you know what? The Bible talks about it so much because it's really hard to do. It's really hard to do. Listening is different than hearing, you know? Listening requires feedback to the person who's sharing something. And the feedback is bouncing back to them what you hear that person saying, the words, the emotions, the voice, you know, the cry of the heart, so to speak, you know, those deep yearnings of the soul. You know, it's communicating that you understand. It's an amazing thing. And, you know, to me, I love you're talking also about connectedness and intimacy and attachment and relationships. It's so critically important. And again, I believe that's what God designed us for, is to connect in those significant ways. And so listening ushers in the opportunity to create this experience in relationship where a person has the experience of being understood. And when a person is understood, not only does that promote that attachment and connectedness, it also provides an amazing opportunity to share mutually, you know, and getting into that dance of, you know, that dance that kind of typifies those patterns of interaction that happen, like in a marriage, you know, when there's mutual sharing, mutual listening, mutual understanding. Yeah, it really is a beautiful process to see that play out. And unfortunately, when we're stressed, when we're living life at a frenetic pace, when we have so many demands, when all the juice is disappearing from the refrigerator and we have to run to the store again, you know, all those kinds of things, when those things are happening, it's hard, like you were talking about too, Joyce, to slow down. Yes. Slow down and create the opportunities for that kind of significant connectedness. So, you know, I really think communication is primarily about that, because usually people are willing to talk if they know they're going to be heard. Usually, yes. There's some exceptions, but if you can create that climate of eagerness to understand, I really like the idea of having a stance of curiosity. You know, being curious about other people, because that curiosity promotes the that really what we call active listening. So,
no, I like that, and I see that you were nodding your head to Mia.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm just like I'm eating this all up.
I love it all.
Yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't agree more. You know, just about when we talk about communication, you know, what is it that you're inviting, right? A lot of times, as I referenced, I think in, you know, the first time we started meeting like this, when we are stressed, we're holding that tension in our body, we're in that fight or flight mode. And now my spouse is no longer my spouse. They're this tiger that's trying to maul me, right? And I forget that they're my partner. I see them as something I have to defend myself against. And so I think when you said stance, Steve, that stance of curiosity, also just letting your defenses down, right? Because remember, the person that you married isn't your enemy, right? And so doing those things that allow you to remember that even though in this moment, I may not agree with you or how things are being done, but I know you're not my enemy. Right? And so it's really, what are you inviting? And so when you're communicating, if I'm starting off a sentence out of that critical voice, right? You did this or you didn't do that. That automatically is inviting the response to be defensive. So I have to check that. Unless I'm about to say you're a rock star, right? I probably need to check my yous and start them off with I, right? And that's me taking ownership of something in that big laundry bag I'm carrying around.
Right.
Right. And so I don't want to start off something from that critical voice, right? Then I'm just inviting defensiveness, right? Or again, sometimes we get to the point where, you know, they say something, our spouse says something, and I'm already rolling my eyes. I'm like, oh God, or I'm already thinking, you know, what's going to be my rebuttal, right? So I'm hearing, but I'm not listening. And that's inviting contempt. right? They're already dismissed. I'm already saying the thing that you have to say is not important to me. And again, what am I inviting? I'm probably inviting what the Gottmans, and they do a lot of couples and relationship counseling, but they call it stonewalling, right? Where after a while, I'm completely emotionally unavailable.
Yeah.
Right. So there's no connection. I'm not giving you a plug-in anywhere.
Mm.
Yeah.
Right. And so the pattern and the routine of being critical, of being, defensive, of saying things out of that contemptive kind of place, it only invites stonewalling. And now I'm just writing my own scripts. Right now I become like a Hollywood script person, right? And I'm writing this whole thing about what I said and then what you said and then this, and none of that has happened. But I have created that in my mind, and now the problem is even bigger.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it all starts with, I love that stance of curiosity, right?
Yes.
And how you're standing, right? And just letting go of that defense.
Oh, yeah, I think that's really good. And you were saying, stonewalling, and I immediately understood because you kind of did the face, and you were like, I could do that face really good. but that is, you are still communicating, but you're communicating something that is not good for the conversation, not good for the situation, not good for the relationship, because you're communicating. I'm not listening to what you're saying. You're not saying anything that is that means anything to me. So that's part of the communicating. And so I really like what you were saying, is that you and tying into what Steve is saying, is that you really need to actively listen and show that you care. So no, I like it. And so with that, when are there boundaries needed? And how do we create those boundaries in a marriage? But since you're right there, Tamia, could you start with that?
I jotted down some notes, and I think that the creation of those boundaries hopefully started happening back when you were like dating and courting each other, right? I think sometimes it's hard to just create, those habits usually don't last long, right? They're kind of like the fad diet, right? I'm just going to eat cabbage soup for the next 6 days, and then, right? Like that doesn't work. And sometimes when we want to just kind of pop up this surprise like thing in the midst of our relationship, that doesn't work, right? And then it's stinky, right? Because I've done the cabbage soup. I didn't last very long, but so I think that those boundaries hopefully started way before the relationship was really formalized and unionized in marriage, because before we met, I was me. And I think that there is a figuring out, where is there room still for me and my stuff? And now I have to make room for us. Right. And then in the same token, my partner or my spouse, he needs to make room for his stuff and then also our stuff. Right. So it's kind of like there's you, there's me, there's us, and if there are children involved, there's all of us. And each one needs its own time. Right. And when you find that there's not a lot of time for one aspect of that, then things start to go a little haywire. So I think the boundaries, were hopefully there to begin with. Right. But if they aren't, then it's, I think, slow walking, pacing, right? Again, let's not do the surprise cabbage diet in our relationship.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you brought in, the dynamics of family. If you have kids, what about, if you have kids, these couples have these, young people, that's what they are. They're little people living with you. And you're co-parenting. Any tips for that, Steve?
Yeah, sure. And I wanted to make a couple of comments about boundaries because, really the way I look at boundaries is we use boundaries all the time to regulate relationships, and most of the time we use boundaries without really even thinking about it, like, for example, we setting up this time together, we had an invitation on a Google Calendar or whatever it was, okay, and we were all agreed to show up at the same time, and we agreed to show up in this capacity. I'm guessing, to me, if I had showed up at your house and knocked on the door, you would have been a little surprised, right? Because we kind of have an agreed upon, boundary that this is how we were going to meet together, right? And that's, kind of a silly, but an example of kind of how boundaries work on a regular basis. And so we use boundaries to regulate relationships, specifically, in terms of the parent-child relationship. I think there's some things that are really, really important. In fact, in the last session that we had, when we were talking about, helping parents help their kids deal with the stress of the times that we're in, COVID and the other challenges we've all experienced this past year. There was a comment made in the chat room, which we didn't get to, but I wanted to make a comment about that because I think it fits. Somebody had made the comment, because we were talking about friendship and parenting, parent-child friendship. And the comment was, if I read it correctly, I'm really not a friend to my child. And I was thinking about that, and I think it is a really, really important comment, because in a sense, we have the privilege as parents to parent our children. It's a very, very special relationship. I have a lot of friends. I have 2 kids, and so in a sense, it's even more special than friendship. And the relationship absolutely can be friendly. But at the same time, sometimes as parent, you got to say, no, you can't do that. Or no, don't even think about doing that. Or, hey, you did this, now you have to pay the price. Or, all those parental things we need to do, which you would never do with a friend, right? I mean, that wouldn't be your place. That wouldn't be the kind of relationship. So just in a lot of ways, the type of relationship between parents and kids can be super close in terms of intimate, safe, again, that whole, curiosity thing, and the stance kind of works in that one too, and how you're, position yourself for the kids, because, we have this responsibility to be like an authority figure, which is, it's just no fun, right? When you got to tell kids you can't do something, none of us really like doing that, but at the same time, we had that responsibility. So to some degree, it's really important to be able to communicate and teach our kids, those kind of relationship dynamics, and boundaries become a big part of that. Plus there's some, if it's okay, I want to kind of talk about the boundaries in terms of marriage as well, because, we know from the scripture that a marriage is 2 become 1, right? Does that mean you're no longer 2 individual people? It doesn't mean that at all. You have individual lives, individual interests, and but you're a marriage, you're a unit, okay? And that's what that oneness is. And there's tons of ways that intimacy plays out. One of the things that I talk with couples about from time to time, and also think about in my own marriage, but the pursuit of intimacy, attachment, closeness, knowing each other, that is scary. It really is. Why is it scary? Because we're allowing ourselves to be vulnerable in that relationship. And when you're vulnerable, you can be hurt. And by the way, because we're broken, it oftentimes happens that there's going to be hurt there. The beautiful thing is we're also taught about love, forgiveness, mercy, and grace. And that's what, leads to that restoration and reconciliation and healing in that relational component. But in terms of boundaries within that context, unfortunately, sometimes relationships deteriorate. And sometimes, in that effort maybe to have communication, when it starts falling apart and you're left in this place of resentment, unfortunately, words can become abusive. Sometimes things can become even abusive on a physical level. And those are times that it's critically important to establish boundaries, to basically communicate. When you talk to me this way, I can't hear you. And so I'm going to disengage from this conversation right now. You know, it's also really important. Another thing that can happen a lot of times in efforts to communicate is the stonewalling certainly happens, you know, and that's kind of like a Uber boundary, you know, force field, you're not coming through this, you know, which, and I'll get to that in a second. But the other thing that can happen is there can be escalation, you know, where it's sort of like, you know, in trying to be heard, the emotions are going up and up and up. Everybody's trying to be heard, nobody's listening. And at this point, you know, when things escalate, nothing good happens, you know? And so boundaries, especially when they're agreed upon boundaries established ahead of time. Hey, when I'm in a place like here, I am not in a position to have a conversation right now. So I need to step away. And what that does is it lets the floodwaters come back down of that emotional intensity and those thoughts that are racing and kind of driven from that emotional intensity. And then when you de-escalate, you can get back to that point of maybe having a conversation that's beneficial and fruitful. So I think there are some strategic uses of boundaries. But I also just want to make one more comment, because sometimes boundaries can be used more as a weapon, okay, to try to maintain control. And I don't think that's a healthy use of boundaries, you know. And, you know, if you ever, you know, literally had a door slammed in your face, that's a boundary, right? It hurt your face because the door just hit you in the face. You know, it certainly sends a message, but it's a painful message. And it's a destructive message. You know, if you think about the same kind of thing with, and sometimes even with the stonewalling, you know, that can be hurtful to the other person,
Right.
And depending on how it's done. And so I think it's just something to keep in mind that, you know, when we utilize boundaries in a strategic way to regulate the relationship, to create safety, sometimes to create a little space so that, you know, positive things can happen, or at least you interrupt a negative pattern. I think it can be a very, very important use of boundaries, but used as a weapon, that could be destructive. So.
Absolutely. That was awesome. That was awesome. Yeah.
It was. It was a lot, and I like it. I like it. Yes. Any other resources, any other tips or resources that you could provide for those who are listening?
You know, something that Steve was just saying about those boundaries, those hard boundaries that can hurt. It's funny, I actually have a little sticky. I don't even remember when I wrote this, but it says healthy boundaries don't come from burdened places. Right. So if I'm going around slamming doors, then I'm probably hurt, right? And then I'm trying to hurt somebody else. So just checking our own laundry bag. And I think that when we find, you know, that our laundry bag is heavy, it's hurting me, I know it's hurting other people, then that's one of those clear signs that I may need a little extra outside help for what's going on. And another thing that you were saying, you know, as you're escalating, I'm getting the sense that you're probably not breathing, right? Like, right. So that goes back to your other point, like just breathe. In the heat of the moment, you know, I can say a whole lot of words and not take a single breath. But if I'm breathing, then that impact is so much different. If I'm like, I really want to share with you why I am just so upset right now. Right? Like that, putting that breath can change the delivery and then what you're inviting back into the conversation. But if I'm just going, and it's been like 5 minutes, right? Like Michael Phelps have nothing on me when I'm upset, right? I can hold my breath for days, right? Just trying to get my point across because I'm not breathing. And then that's not functioning in the way that God intended our bodies to function, because we need oxygen.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I love it. Love it. Well, I think I'll mention just take a pause here and mention one of our partners at University of Maryland. They're working on a Together program, which they're launching this year. Some workshops, and their Together program is a free program that focuses on relationships. They focus on stress management, teaching tips on stress management, as well as financial management, because we know financial issues are the root to most of the stress in a marriage with any couples. But so their programs are free, like I mentioned, and they focus on stress management, the financial management skills as well. And more information can be found at their website at togetherprogram.org. So thought I'd put that out there for as a resource. Do you guys have any other resources that you could mention and provide for our audience?
If people like to study about boundaries, a book that probably many have heard about is the Boundaries book by Cloud and Townsend. It really is a phenomenal resource, and learning how to utilize boundaries in a strategic way. And it's also written from a faith-based perspective. And it's actually the only book I know of that really addresses this topic in this way. And yeah, it's been around for a long time, and it's revised a few years ago. It's a very good resource, I think. So
cool. Anything from you, Tamia?
Just like I said, I mentioned the Gottmans, and they do a lot of relationship work. They're kind of like the gurus. I know in my training in wanting to, do counseling and then do couples counseling. And they have a lot of free resources, online, a lot of really helpful tips, activities, and, kind of building different levels of intimacy, different activities. They also talk about, that criticism, content, defensiveness, and stonewalling. So they have a lot of resources that are free, for those to, because sometimes if you just Google certain words, it can get you into trouble. So I think, being mindful of that. But I do like a lot of the work that the Gottmans put out in terms of just couples relationship building, and a lot of those resources are free.
yeah, just to piggyback on that, there's an app for the Gottman Institute, I think is what it's called. It's actually really useful too. So if you're into apps, I get almost a daily kind of little blog, and a lot of them, I can't read them every day, but a lot of them are really, really helpful. So I love the Gottman work as well.
Oh, nice. Thank you for that. Thank you. Well, thank you both again for this. You both are our experts that have provided tips on managing stress, anxiety, working, couples working together. We talked today about just waiting, stopping, taking a breath, listening to each other, being active listeners, curious listeners. We talked about our boundaries and not creating them and turning them into a weapon. We received a lot of good tips and encouragement to be intentional about what you do and keeping that relationship good and strong. So I thank you again for you both, Steve from Safe Harbor, Tamia from Natalie Therapeutics. Again, thank you for links to these counseling resources and additional COVID-19 coping tips and resources. Visit our website at 360wholeness.org and go to our COVID-19 coping tips page for all 4 of our sessions for the COVID-19 coping tips series. Thanks again.
Thank you.